dear learners, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we will be talking about how to create the XML configuration file for a Spring MVC application and what are the various controller annotations that are needed to create a Spring MVC application. In our previous video, we had seen what exactly is a dispatcher servlet and how a dispatcher servlet plays a very important role in configuring the whole application, in making sure that every incoming request that we have is passed through the dispatcher servlet and then it gets routed to the appropriate controller which can provide us the service that we are asking for, right? So we had talked about dispatcher servlet, we had talked about how to configure this particular dispatcher servlet inside the web.xml file. What are how do you configure the servlet tag, the servlet mapping tag? We had also configured an init param inside which we were configuring our XML configuration file for the Spring MVC application. So that same XML configuration file that we had seen last time, we will be talking about that file in detail today, of what exactly that file is and how that needs to be configured. Now, in our earlier videos also, when we had started talking about Spring, we had configured the XML configuration file for our basic Spring application. Not MVC, but yes, for a normal Spring application also, we had configured the Spring configuration file. It is going to be a similar file. We will configure beans here also, but these are going to be more specific related to the Spring MVC. Okay, so let's get started. Now, if you see, the Spring configuration file is usually placed inside the web-inf folder. That is where you put it and that is where you store it usually. Okay, and it is named something like this, as you can see here, servlet name dash servlet.xml. So let's say if the name of my servlet in the web.xml file is dispatcher, okay, then I will be naming this as dispatcher-servlet.xml. If you have not seen my previous video, you can check out my previous video here wherein we had configured our web.xml file with the dispatcher servlet. So whatever servlet name that you give there for the dispatcher servlet is what you mention here. Okay, so that's servlet name dash servlet.xml. Now again, understand, this is not compulsory that you have to always name it like this only. You can name it differently also if you want, but this is what is recommended, but it is not mandatory. Usually this is useful if you have multiple configuration files and for per servlet you are creating a different configuration file. This is applicable, or this is more useful for you to differentiate which servlet does this configuration file belong to. So that is why, or that is where this is more useful. Otherwise, you can name it whatever you want. It is not mandatory that it has to be named like this. You can name it as you please and it will still work as far as the path is correct. So as I said, although this naming convention is not mandatory, Spring gives you the flexibility of naming it as far as the path is correct, as I said earlier. Okay, so this could be an example, like let's say if the servlet name is dispatcher, okay, so you can name the configuration file as dispatcher-servlet.xml. So you can name it as whatever you wish to, but this is one of the suggestions that are being given. Now, this Spring configuration file needs to configure three things primarily for a basic Spring MVC app to work. Okay, one, we need to configure the component scanning. Okay, so that it can find the packages, or the Spring container can look for packages where it can find all the controllers or all the container managed objects. So component scanning is the place where we mention that these are the packages where you need to look for Spring Spring components, whatever, could be controller, service, or your entity. So any sort of auto-wired container or auto-wire component you want to find, or the Spring wants to find, this is where Spring container will look for it. So that's one thing that you need to configure, that is the the component scanning. That is one thing. The second thing that we have is you need to configure the support for annotation driven MVC controllers. Okay, so this is one more a tag that you need to configure inside your Spring configuration file to tell that my MVC controllers are going to be annotation driven. I will be using annotations to create my controllers, and annotations for all my request mappings is what this particular tag is going to tell my Spring container, so that it will then start looking for in these packages that we've mentioned here, that where exactly these files are that we are looking for. So these two, you can say, in a way are connected to each other. One more configuration that we need to do, a basic configuration, is that of a view resolver. Usually, as I have said earlier also in my previous videos, this is as of now going to be an internal resource view resolver, but this can be something else also. Like this could be a view resolver for some PDF file or some Excel file. So this could be different view resolvers that we want for our application. So it can depend on that also. Except these basic configurations, there are other configurations also that are done here, like database related configurations. So in our future videos, when we will be talking about Hibernate and Spring together, is when I will discuss that also, that how those Hibernate configurations or database related configurations are done in the configuration file. But as of now, this is the most basic configuration that you will need. The configuration looks something like this. For the component scanning, you need to say context : component scan base package com.learning.controller. So this is the package where it will look for your files. Okay, so that is what you need to provide here. Then you need to provide the MVC annotation driven. This is for the support for annotation driven MVC controllers. You need to use this particular annotation. This is newly added, okay, from Spring 3 onwards. This has been added, that is MVC : annotation driven, to support annotation based MVC controllers. Okay, and finally you need this configuration of the internal resource view resolver. As I have said earlier also, as of now we are going to see only internal resource view resolver. In our future videos, we will also talk about more specific view resolvers or more specific views. And this is the configuration. You need a prefix and a suffix to give an exact path or to get an exact path of the view, or where the view is located and what kind of view it is. So two things it holds: where the view is and what kind of view it is. Okay, so here you can also have HTML files. That's also possible. So that is what we've mentioned here. We will talk about this also in detail in our next video, wherein we are in detail going to discuss what are view resolvers, what are their types, and how can we use the internal resource view resolver in our code. So that is where we will talk about it in more detail. Going further, talking about the controllers and the request mapping. So once this XML configuration is done, you need to now start writing a code. So for creating a controller, you need to create a class, okay, and that particular class will be annotated using a controller annotation. So this controller annotation will tell my Spring container that this class that we are talking about is going to be my controller. Okay, so it indicates, as I said earlier, that the particular class serves the role of controller, as I said earlier. Also, once you are using the controller annotation, you will not separately need to extend any controller base class or refer to any servlet API. The controller annotation will take care of making sure that the class behaves as a controller. Okay, and the purpose of this controller annotation is only stereotyping and annotating our class so that the Spring container is aware that there is such a class which is going to behave as a controller for us. Okay, so as you can see here, the dispatcher will scan such annotated classes for mapped methods detecting the request mapping annotation. So in such classes, my dispatcher will look for methods which have this @request mapping annotation over the methods. Okay, so that is where it will actually find the request URL. Okay, these request mapping, the methods on top of which we will be using this request mapping annotation will be the actual method which will get called on a particular request that we have. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about request mapping now. So request mapping annotation is used to map URLs, like for example /goodbye onto an entire, so it could be either on an entire class that you are annotating it, or you could also annotate it to specific methods. It can be both also. You are annotating it on top of the class also and on top of the method also. This is useful in cases when we have similar methods in different classes. Okay, so let's say I have inheritance into picture, let's say, and I have two different child classes having similar functionalities, but in a particular scenario I want to call only one particular functionality. That is when annotating both the class as well as the method with a request mapping annotation helps, because then it is easy to differentiate. Okay, so that is how it helps. And this request and mapping annotation, as I said, can be mapped at type level and method level both. And typically type level is used to it becomes a part of the path, specific request path or path pattern for a form controller. And method level then further narrows it down to a specific request, a get or a post request that has come from the client, or any other specific HTTP request for that matter that has come from the client, and that is what it directly maps to. So if I talk about the one at the type level, that is more of a path pattern, or you can say a part of the path pattern, whereas the one which is a method is a more specific one. It is the actual request that we are asking for. Okay, if you see an example here, you can see I have this hello controller here, and I have this goodbye method here, and on top of the goodbye method you can see I have this request mapping, which is having a value of /goodbye. So I can have a URL, something like this. Let's say I can have a request that says http ://localhost. Let's assume localhost. Okay, :8080/my app/ then I can have a goodbye request. Okay, so my request could be something like this. Okay, the incoming request that would map to a request something like this, or a request mapping like this. Okay, so that is how it would work. And then going further, if let's say I have another controller, this is another example wherein I am now using a request mapping on top of the class also. So on top of class I have a request mapping, as well as I have request mapping on top of the method also. So here the request that I have would be something like this. Just a moment, I'll show you how this request would look like. So it would look like something like this: http ://localhost :8080 /my app. Then here in the earlier case it was directly goodbye, something like this, correct? It was something like this, but in this case it is going to be like this: hello, and then after hello we will have goodbye. So it will look something like this: hello /goodbye. This is, as I said earlier, useful in cases when I have, let's say I have two methods wherein I'll be using a similar request mapping, that is, as you can see, goodbye. So in those cases it will be useful. So if there are scenarios wherein there are two different controllers having similar request mappings at method level, to differentiate them from each controller, this controller level request mapping will help. So that is where it is more useful. Otherwise also it is good to segregate it properly, class wise and method wise. It becomes easier to find them. So that way also it is easier. So that is how it can come. So this is it about request mapping and our controller annotation and the XML configuration file that we have for the Spring MVC app. In our next video we will be now talking about view resolvers, and we will be talking about method model classes, and these model classes will help us understand how exactly the data matches with the database, or how exactly it maps with any sort of data source for that matter, not just database, and how that data is read. Once that is done, we will get into the details of then writing a whole set of code using all these different components that we have learned over these whatever 3-4 videos that we have seen: dispatcher, servlet, the XML configuration file, the Spring configuration file that we have, the controller annotation, the request mapping annotation, the model class. So we will see a complete example that will use these different components. So that is it for today. If you like my content, please like my videos, share it with your family and friends. And please subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed yet. That is it for today. Thank you. Bye bye.